This is interesting. This is the writer of Hebrews is talking about Moses and what happened back there, and he's going on to teach this beautiful lesson. Actually, he has multiple lessons on this in that book, but he's teaching this beautiful lesson about how that went before Jesus, before Christ, and was part of the law and all that it was actually shadows, if you will, of what is now the real thing. Jesus is the fulfillment of all those things which the people were looking forward to. But I want to pick up on another thought here, and it's just a principle, I guess. He says, they offer worship in a sanctuary, that is, these people under the law and all that, that is a sketch and shadow of the heavenly one, the heavenly sanctuary. So, oh my goodness, for Moses, when he was about to erect the tent, that is the tabernacle, was warned, see that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain. So this is interesting. The word that's really operable for what I'm wanting to say here is pattern. This is one time that God gave the pattern for something to be built, and it was very specific, very detailed. And God even intended that this be built in such a way that he gifted people and gave gifts to some that they would be skilled craftsmen to know how to build this wonderful tabernacle in the wilderness. Okay. Later on there would come the temple, right? But right now we have this tent that is the home for the law and all that. And then I've discovered something a while back that I think is profound, that we should be aware of if we weren't already. And that is, interestingly enough, the law, to my knowledge, that is the Pentateuch, the Torah, that Torah, says nothing about the temple. Why is that important? Because that is a change in the law. You can't get around and say, well, it's just the tabernacle tent that now is made. No, it's a vast change. If the construction of the tabernacle, which is just a fancy word for tent, the big tent, okay. If the construction of the tent was God's plan, he gave that to Moses, and we're seeing that evidence of that here in the New Testament. But where in the law did God say, and by the way, if you ever get tired of this tabernacle or when it wears out, you just put it aside, and if you want to do something different, wait a minute. So I asked a fellow at a conference I was at here, it's been a couple of 3 years ago now, who really is, I would say, an expert in the law and those issues. And he's not a law keeper, he understands what covenant he's under, but he really understands the law and the perspectives of that, and he's great on prophecy and all that. But I asked him, I said, am I missing the point? I said, is there any place in the law that tells about the construction of the temple, and that when you do that, it'll be okay to redo everything and make that in? And he thought like he'd never thought of that before. But he said, no, there isn't. How profound is that? And yet, God honored and respected the worship of the people in the temple. How big a change is it? Massive. Huge. And that's why we shouldn't be confused that when the Messiah came, when the Christ came on the scene, he brought this incredible, spectacular new covenant. We shouldn't be confused thinking, well, we're supposed to be keeping the old one. Not really. That's an awful mistake. When Jesus came on the scene, he was the master of all these things. When he came on the scene, He gave us a new covenant, which he expresses, remember, in what's referred to as the Last Supper, but he expresses there and says, this is, when he holds up the cup, remember, this is the new covenant in my blood. So there's a new covenant shed for all the people in the blood of Jesus Christ, dedicated by his blood, not the blood of bulls and goats. The first covenant was a stand-in. It's like we talk about this wonderful fellow John, the baptizer. Okay, John, he came on the scene, but he was like a forerunner. Just his purpose was to get the people ready for and bring them to Christ. Once that happened, John actually went off the scene. John actually says at one point, he said, I must decrease so that he may increase. So we're not under John's provisions now, are we? I mean, it was great. We see what he was saying, we see what he was doing. He had a part. But once the one came that John was prepping for, if you will, we're under him because he was a forerunner. There was a sense in which Moses and the law and all of those things were actually serving that same purpose of being forerunners to Jesus and to his new covenant. But when we say that this covenant is new, it doesn't mean it's sort of a redraft of the old one or kind of fixing it a little. No, it's an all new arrangement between God and his people. Moses was indeed a forerunner to Christ. The law was a forerunner of Christ's covenant, which we're privileged to live under. The business of the priesthood, the writer of Hebrews will tell us, the priesthood, the Aaronic priesthood, if you will, Aaron and his descendants, that was actually forerunning for the real priesthood of Christ. But just as we're no longer under the provisions of John the Baptist, neither are we under the provisions of Moses and his law, which were just stand-ins, prepping. In fact, the scripture actually says that. Paul says it in the book of Galatians. He tells his people there, he says, you know, the law served this purpose. It was to bring us to Christ. But after Christ has come, we don't need that anymore. Say, I receive this frequently from those wanting to argue with me on our 21st Century Reformation. But I get people saying, well, for goodness sakes, if you're not under the law, then you can kill people and you can lie and you can... No, you can't. Wow. Why? Because our new covenant does all of those things were just prepping, helping us to foresee what would be established in the eternal covenant of Jesus Christ. The law was for a time and for a season. It served a purpose. It was of God. But it was not God's ultimate plan or program. God's ultimate plan and program was to be given through his Son, not through the prophet Moses. And Moses was great, and Aaron was great, and all those things were wonderful, and they were amazing. But all of that was just to bring us to Christ, to the Messiah. And when he comes, what does he say? He says, well, okay, you got to keep the law, otherwise you'd be able to kill and steal and maim and do all. No. Jesus says, here's my commandment, that you love one another. If I love my neighbor, I will not kill him. If I love my neighbor, I will not steal from him. If I love my neighbor, I won't steal his wife. All the things that you can picture. Jesus caught it and just said, here it is. So, no, I don't have to hear Moses. I mean, it's okay. I'm glad Moses had what he had. It was wonderful. But I don't have to hear Moses in order to know I'm not supposed to kill people. I don't have to hear Moses to decide I shouldn't be lying or bearing false witness. Jesus brings all these things to bear in his covenant. The other was a foretaste, a forerunner. We're under the real thing. Guess what? What Moses had served a purpose for a time, but what Jesus has brought serves an eternal purpose. This is God's eternal plan for humanity and all who will be saved. This is eternal in Jesus Christ. So, wow, I think it's an awful mistake to say, well, we've got to keep the law. Well, actually, we don't. Interestingly enough, the law was for particular people. The law didn't exist until Moses. You ever think about that? The law did not exist before Moses because the law came by Moses, okay? So when Moses came on the scene and he brought that law, okay, it's called the law of Moses. It's great. He brought that on the scene. It was wonderful. It was great. But God never said, this is my eternal plan. This is the way it's going to be. In fact, if you read the book of Hebrews, you discover that in some of these very writings that we're looking at here, in some of those writings, it says, you know, the blood of bulls and goats couldn't really please God, not in the big picture. This business of the priesthood that offered the blood and sacrifice of blood, you know, that was, again, for a time, it served a purpose. And it wasn't just brutality or something. Actually, those sacrifices served for the food for people. And it was served for the food for the priests and others. It was a wonderful system, a program, okay. But wow, when Jesus comes on the scene, now we've got the one that was just trying to get us to. We've got both him and we've got his program that God has given him, the eternal program. So Jeremiah made this amazing statement. He said, well, you know, brought it this, the time is coming what? That I will make a new covenant. New covenant with the house of Israel. Not according to the one, the writer of Hebrews is going to say, not according to the one that was made back in the beginning. Not according to that one? No. So, wow, Jesus came along and he said in John 15, he said, here's the deal. If you keep my commandments, then you are my disciples. Then you'll bear fruit. Then you'll be pleasing to God if you keep my commandments. He didn't say if you keep Moses' commandments. Isn't that interesting? He said if you keep my commandments. Interesting. Moses had nothing on Jesus. In fact, he, like John the Baptist, as I say, Moses was a forerunner to Jesus, to get people to him. So it's an interesting thing then that Jesus comes on the scene. He fulfills the law. That doesn't mean as people think, I think. Oftentimes, I guess I used to think the same thing, but we think fulfilling the law means he kept the law, he kept it diligently and kept it really well. Not really. That's not what was going on. Jesus fulfilled the law, meaning he accomplished the things the law was foretelling about, the things the law was foreseeing, the things the law was preparing for. The law was foreseeing Jesus. Remember, in Deuteronomy, the 18th chapter, in verse 15 and on, that you have this God speaking to Moses and saying, I will raise up to them, the people. There's coming a time when I will raise up to them a prophet like unto you, he's going to be a prophet like you, from among his brethren. And when that time comes, everyone must hear him. And if you don't hear him, God will require it of you.